The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in November. Marcus had invited Catherine and her parents over for dinner to discuss what he called finalizing the engagement details. David sat at the massive dining room table, listening to his father and Catherine's father talk about wedding venues and guest lists as if he were not even present. "I think a spring wedding would be lovely," Catherine's mother was saying. "Perhaps May? The gardens at the country club will be in full bloom." "Excellent choice," Marcus agreed. "David, what do you think?" David looked around the table at the faces staring at him expectantly. Catherine smiled sweetly, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Her parents beamed with satisfaction at the advantageous match their daughter was making. His father looked pleased with himself for orchestrating what he considered the perfect business and social alliance. "I think," David said slowly, setting down his wineglass, "that I need to be honest with everyone." The conversation stopped abruptly. Grace, who had been serving the main course, paused near the kitchen doorway. "I'm not going to marry Catherine," David announced clearly. "I'm sorry, but I can't continue pretending that I want a future I never chose for myself." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine's face went white, then flushed red with embarrassment. Her father's expression hardened immediately. "David, what are you saying?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm saying that I don't love Catherine. And I'm not going to marry her just because our families think it's a good business arrangement," David replied, standing from his chair. "Catherine, you deserve someone who loves you completely. Not someone who's going through the motions because his father arranged it." Catherine stood as well, her composure cracking. "David, you can't be serious. We're perfect together." "Everyone says so." "Everyone except me," David said gently. "I'm sorry, Catherine, I truly am." Catherine's father threw his napkin down on the table. "Marcus, I don't know what kind of game your son is playing, but this is completely unacceptable. We've already made announcements to our friends." "David, sit down," Marcus commanded, his voice taking on the tone he used in hostile business negotiations. "We'll discuss this privately after our guests leave." "No, Dad, I'm done with private discussions that end with you telling me what I'm going to do with my life," David said firmly. "I've made my decision." With that, David walked out of the dining room, leaving behind a table full of shocked faces. He could hear raised voices beginning to argue behind him, but he didn't stop. Instead, he went straight to the kitchen where he found Grace standing by the sink, her hands shaking as she pretended to wash dishes. "Grace?" David said softly. She turned to face him, tears in her eyes. "David, what have you done? Your father will be furious." "I've done what I should have done months ago," David replied, taking her hands in his. "I've chosen the woman I love instead of the woman my father picked for me." "You can't choose me," Grace whispered. "I'm the maid, David. I don't have money or connections or any of the things your world expects." "You have something none of those women have," David said, cupping her face gently. "You have my heart." Before Grace could protest further, David kissed her. It was soft and tender and everything David had imagined it would be. When they finally broke apart, Grace was crying. "I love you too," she whispered. "But David, this will destroy your relationship with your father." "It might destroy your life." "Then we'll build a new life," David said simply. "Together." Their conversation was interrupted by Marcus storming into the kitchen, his face red with rage. "David, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "Having a private conversation," David replied calmly, though he didn't release Grace's hands. Marcus looked between his son and Grace, and David could see the moment when understanding dawned on his father's face. The realization was followed immediately by disgust. "Are you telling me," Marcus said slowly, "that you humiliated the Morrison family and ruined a merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars because you think you're in love with the help?" "I'm telling you that I'm in love with Grace and I'm going to marry her," David said, pulling Grace closer to his side. "Whether you approve or not?" Marcus stared at them for a long moment, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that looked almost like grief. "She's using you," Marcus said finally. "Can't you see that? She's a gold digger who's manipulated you into thinking you love her." "That's enough," David said sharply. "Don't you dare insult Grace like that." "David," Grace said softly. Maybe I should go. No, David said firmly. You're not going anywhere. Dad, if you want to have this conversation, then let's have it. But I won't tolerate you disrespecting the woman I love. Marcus looked at his son as if seeing a stranger. I can't believe this. After everything I've given you, everything I've built for this family, you're going to throw it all away for some nobody who cleans our house. Grace isn't a nobody, David replied. She's intelligent, kind, hardworking, and she makes me want to be a better man. She's studying to be a nurse so she can spend her life helping sick children. What do any of those socialites you parade around here do with their lives besides spend money and attend parties? Those women understand our world, Marcus shot back. They know how to behave in society, how to support a man in business, how to raise children who will carry on our family legacy. What legacy? David asked. Money? Superficial social connections? A life where every decision is based on what other people will think? I don't want that legacy, Dad. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was cold. If you go through with this, you're no longer my son. I'll cut you out of the company, out of my will, out of this family entirely. You'll have nothing. David felt Grace tense beside him, but he didn't waver. Then I'll have nothing. But I'll have Grace, and that's worth more to me than all the money in the world. David, please, Grace said quietly. You don't have to do this. I can't let you give up everything for me. You're not making me give up anything, David replied. I'm choosing what matters most to me. Marcus looked at them both with an expression of complete bewilderment. You're both insane. Grace, you can't possibly want this. You'll be cut off from society, ostracized by everyone who matters. And you'll never know if people accept you for who you are or just tolerate you because of David's money. With respect, sir, Grace said, finding her voice. I've never cared about being accepted by people who judge others based on money or social status. And I love David for who he is, not what he owns. This is ridiculous, Marcus muttered, running his hands through his hair. David, I'm giving you one chance to come to your senses. End this foolishness, apologize to the Morrisons, and marry Catherine like we planned. No, David said simply. Marcus stared at his son for a long moment, then turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word. The next few days were tense and difficult. Marcus barely spoke to David, and when he did, it was only about business matters. Catherine's family was furious and threatening legal action over what they called breach of promise, though David's lawyers assured him they had no case since no formal engagement had ever been announced. Grace tried several times to convince David to reconsider, telling him she would rather leave than see him lose his family. But David was resolute. He had never felt more certain about anything in his life. A week after the confrontation, David made his decision official. He resigned from his position at his father's company and announced his engagement to Grace. The news sent shockwaves through New York's high society, with some people expressing outrage and others secretly admiring David's courage to follow his heart. David found a job with a smaller technology company, taking a significant pay cut but discovering that he enjoyed the work more when he wasn't under his father's shadow. He and Grace found a modest apartment in Brooklyn, far from the luxury penthouse he had grown up in, but it felt more like home than any place he had ever lived. Grace continued her nursing studies and graduated at the top of her class. When she was offered a position at a prestigious children's hospital, she accepted eagerly, finally able to pursue the dream she had worked so hard to achieve. Their wedding was small and simple, held in Grace's childhood church in Atlanta with her grandmother and a handful of close friends in attendance. Grace wore a simple white dress that cost less than what David used to spend on a single dinner out. But she had never looked more beautiful to him. Marcus did not attend the wedding. He had kept his word about cutting David out of his life, though. David had heard through mutual business contacts that his father spoke about him with a mixture of anger and sadness. 6 months after their wedding, Grace and David were living happily in their small apartment. David had been promoted at his new job and was working on developing technology to help improve medical care for underserved communities. Grace was beloved by her young patients and their families, and she came home every day with stories about the children she was helping. They had less money than David had ever lived with before, but they had something he had never experienced: complete honesty and genuine partnership. Grace challenged him to think differently about the world while he encouraged her dreams and ambitions. One evening, as they sat together on their small balcony watching the sunset, the Henderson charity auction turned out to be exactly the kind of event David had grown to dread. The ballroom of the luxury hotel was filled with New York's elite, all dressed in their finest attire and competing to outbid each other on expensive art pieces and exotic vacation packages. David stood beside Catherine Morrison, who looked stunning in a navy blue gown that perfectly complemented her blonde hair. Catherine was everything his father wanted in a daughter-in-law. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, making polite conversation with the right people and laughing at all the appropriate moments. But as David watched her, he felt like he was observing a performance rather than getting to know a real person. "David, darling, what do you think of the Monet landscape they're auctioning?" Catherine asked, slipping her arm through his as they moved toward the display area. "It's beautiful," David replied automatically, though his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about the conversation he had had with Grace that morning about her volunteer work at a local children's hospital. She spent her rare free hours reading to young patients, bringing them small gifts she had saved up to buy, and simply listening when they needed to talk about their fears. "Daddy thinks we should bid on it for the apartment we'll get after we're engaged," Catherine continued, her words jolting David back to the present. "Engaged?" David stopped walking, staring at her in surprise. Catherine laughed, a sound like wind chimes that somehow felt cold to David's ears. "Oh, don't look so shocked. Everyone knows it's just a matter of time. Our families have been friends for years and we're perfectly suited for each other. Mother already has ideas for the wedding." David felt a knot forming in his stomach. Somehow, while he had been going through the motions of dating Catherine, both families had decided that marriage was inevitable. He had never proposed, never even told Catherine that he loved her, yet everyone seemed to assume that his future was already decided. That night, David returned home feeling more trapped than ever. He found Grace in the kitchen, cleaning up from the dinner she had prepared for Marcus and his business associates. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a plain white blouse and dark skirt that somehow looked more elegant to David than Catherine's expensive gown had. "How was the auction?" Grace asked without looking up from the dishes she was washing. "Predictable," David said, loosening his bow tie and sitting down at the kitchen counter. "Catherine Morrison expects us to be engaged soon." Grace's hand stilled for a moment before she continued washing. "Congratulations," she said quietly. "She seems like a lovely woman. Does she?" David asked, studying Grace's profile. "Do you really think so?" Grace turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. David, it's not my place to have opinions about your personal relationships. I'm not asking you as an employee," David said softly. "I'm asking you as a friend." The word hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that both of them felt but neither dared to acknowledge fully. Grace dried her hands on a kitchen towel, considering her words carefully. "I think," she said finally, "that you should marry someone who makes you happy. Someone who sees the real you, not just what you represent." "And what if that person is someone my father would never approve of?" David asked, his eyes never leaving her face. Grace's breath caught slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Then you have to decide what matters more to you. Your father's approval or your own happiness?" Before David could respond, they heard Marcus's voice calling from the main living room. Grace immediately stepped back, the spell broken, and returned to her professional demeanor. "I should go," she murmured, gathering her cleaning supplies. "Good night, Mr. David." As she left the kitchen, David realized that Grace had given him more honest advice in 5 minutes than anyone else had in years. She had a way of cutting through all the complications and getting to the heart of what really mattered. Over the next several weeks, David began to pay closer attention to the differences between his two worlds. When he was with Catherine and the other socialites, conversations centered around gossip about mutual friends, plans for expensive vacations, and complaints about minor inconveniences. When he talked with Grace, they discussed books, current events, her studies, and her dreams for the future. The contrast became even more stark when Grace's night school had to cancel classes for a week due to a water main break. Instead of going home to her small apartment in Queens, she spent the extra time organizing Marcus's extensive library. David found her there one evening, carefully cataloging first editions and rare books. "You don't have to do this," David said, watching her handle each book with reverence. "This isn't part of your job description." "I know," Grace replied, gently opening a leather-bound volume of poetry. "But your father has such an incredible collection. Some of these books are pieces of history. They deserve to be properly cared for." David picked up a book she had already cataloged, noticing the detailed notes she had made about its condition and significance. "You know a lot about literature?" "My grandmother was a teacher before she retired," Grace explained. "She made sure I read everything I could get my hands on. She used to say that books were the only way to truly understand different perspectives and experiences." That evening, they ended up talking for hours about everything from Shakespeare to contemporary authors. David was amazed by Grace's insights and the depth of her knowledge. She had read many of the same books as Catherine, but while Catherine discussed them as intellectual accessories, Grace engaged with the ideas and emotions behind the words. It was nearly midnight when they realized how late it had gotten. As Grace gathered her things to leave, she stumbled slightly on the library's Persian rug. David reached out to steady her, and this time neither of them pulled away immediately. "Grace," David said softly, his hand still on her arm, "I need to tell you something." But before he could continue, they heard Marcus's footsteps approaching the library. They quickly stepped apart, and Grace busied herself with collecting her cataloging materials. "David? What are you doing up so late?" Marcus asked, appearing in the doorway in his silk robe. "Just reviewing some contracts," David said, gesturing vaguely at the business papers on the desk. Marcus nodded approvingly. "Good. Hard work is what built this empire. Grace, I trust you're nearly finished here? It's quite late for you to still be working." "Yes, sir. I was just finishing up," Grace replied. Not meeting David's eyes as she left the room after she was gone, Marcus sat down across from David. "Son, I've been meaning to talk to you about Catherine. Her father and I have been discussing a potential merger between our companies, and a marriage between you two would certainly strengthen that alliance." David felt his chest tighten. "Dad, you can't be serious. You want me to marry Catherine for a business deal?" "Not just for business," Marcus said, though his tone suggested that business was certainly a major factor. "She's a wonderful girl from an excellent family. She understands our world and would make you a good wife. But what if I don't love her?" David asked. Marcus looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Love? David, love is something that grows over time between compatible people. Your mother and I had an arranged engagement, and we learned to love each other. Sometimes practical considerations are more important than romantic notions." David wanted to argue, to tell his father that he was wrong about love, but he knew it would be pointless. Marcus had built his entire life around practical decisions and calculated risks. The idea that his son might choose passion over profit was incomprehensible. To him, the turning point came 2 weeks later when Grace's grandmother, the woman who had raised her, suffered a heart attack. Grace got the call at work and immediately asked if she could leave to go to the hospital in Atlanta. David overheard her conversation with the household manager and could see the panic in her eyes. Without thinking, David approached her. "Grace, what's wrong?" "My grandmother," Grace said, tears threatening to spill over. "She's in the hospital. I need to get to Atlanta. But I don't know if I can afford the plane ticket, and I don't know how long I'll need to be away, and I might lose my job, and—" "Stop," David said firmly. "Don't worry about any of that. I'll arrange for a flight, and your job will be here when you get back." "I can't accept that," Grace protested. "I couldn't pay you back." "I'm not asking you to," David replied. "Please let me do this." Grace looked at him for a long moment, and David could see her pride warring with her desperation. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." "There's nothing to repay," David said. and just take care of your grandmother." David not only arranged for Grace's flight, but also made sure she had enough money for hotel expenses and meals. He told his father that Grace had a family emergency, though he didn't mention the financial assistance he had provided. Grace was gone for 10 days, and David was surprised by how much he missed her presence in the house. The other household staff did their jobs competently, but the warmth and personal attention that Grace brought to everything were noticeably absent. When she finally returned, Grace looked exhausted but relieved. She found David in his office and knocked softly on the door. "Mr. David, I wanted to thank you again for everything you did. My grandmother is—" Marcus Wellington III stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, gazing down at the city that had made him one of the wealthiest men in America. At 62, he had built an empire from nothing, turning a small tech startup into a global corporation worth billions. But despite all his success, there was one thing that troubled him deeply. His 28-year-old son, David, showed no interest in settling down with what Marcus considered a suitable woman. David Wellington was everything his father had hoped for in an heir. He was intelligent, hardworking, and had a natural talent for business. After graduating from Harvard with an MBA, he had joined the family company and quickly proved himself capable of handling major deals. But when it came to his personal life, David seemed to drift from one casual relationship to another. Never committing to anyone seriously, Marcus had specific ideas about who would make the perfect daughter-in-law. She needed to come from the right family background, have connections in high society, and possess the grace and beauty to represent the Wellington name at charity galas and business events. Most importantly, she needed to understand the responsibilities that came with being part of one of America's most prominent families. "David, we need to talk," Marcus announced one evening as his son returned from another 14-hour day at the office. David loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of whiskey from the crystal decanter on his father's desk. "If this is about the Henderson merger, I've already reviewed all the contracts," David replied. Settling into the leather chair across from his father, Marcus shook his head. "This isn't about business. It's about your future. You're 28 years old, and it's time you started thinking seriously about marriage." But David nearly choked on his drink. "Dad, we've been through this before. I'm focused on my career right now." "Nonsense," Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "I was married to your mother by the time I was your age. You need a wife who can support your ambitions and help secure our family's legacy." Over the next several weeks, Marcus began what he called his campaign. He arranged dinner parties and social events, always making sure to invite the daughters of his wealthy friends and business associates. There was Catherine Morrison, whose father owned a chain of luxury hotels. Sarah Chun came from a family of prominent lawyers and judges. Isabella Rodriguez was the daughter of a media mogul who controlled several television networks. All of these women were undeniably beautiful, educated, and accomplished in their own right. They spoke multiple languages, had advanced degrees, and moved effortlessly through high society circles. Marcus was particularly fond of Catherine, who had a degree in art history and had curated exhibitions at several prestigious museums. "She's perfect for you," Marcus told David after a dinner party where Catherine had impressed everyone with her knowledge of Renaissance paintings. "Beautiful, intelligent, and she comes from excellent breeding." David found himself going through the motions of dating these women, taking them to expensive restaurants and exclusive events. But despite their obvious qualities, he felt no real connection with any of them. They seemed to live in a bubble, surrounded by privilege and luxury, but lacking any understanding of the real world beyond their gilded circles. It was during this time that David began to notice Grace Thompson in a different way. Grace had been working for the Wellington family for 3 years, ever since she moved to New York from Atlanta. She was 26 years old, with warm brown eyes and a smile that could light up any room. Her grandmother had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. Teaching her the value of hard work and treating everyone with respect regardless of their station in life, Grace took care of the Wellington penthouse with meticulous attention to detail. She arrived early each morning, prepared Marcus's coffee exactly how he liked it, managed the household staff, and somehow made their enormous home feel warm and welcoming. She was pursuing a nursing degree at night school, working toward her dream of becoming a pediatric nurse. What struck David most about Grace was her genuine kindness and intelligence. She remembered everything about the family's preferences, from Marcus's favorite newspapers to the specific way David liked his shirts pressed. But more than that, she seemed to see people for who they truly were, not what they owned or where they came from. David began finding excuses to spend time in the kitchen when Grace was preparing meals or organizing the household. He would ask her about her studies, and her face would light up as she described learning about child development and medical procedures. She spoke with such passion about wanting to help sick children that David found himself genuinely moved by her dedication. "Why nursing?" he asked one afternoon as she arranged fresh flowers in the main living room. Grace paused in her work, considering the question. "When I was 15, my grandmother got very sick. We spent months in and out of hospitals, and I saw how the nurses made such a difference. Not just with the medical care, but with kindness and comfort. They treated my grandmother with dignity even when she was at her weakest. I want to be able to do that for other families." David was struck by the sincerity in her voice. Here was someone who had faced real hardship and chosen to dedicate her life to helping others. It was so different from the conversations he had with the socialites his father paraded in front of him, who seemed more concerned with their next vacation destination or the latest fashion trends. As weeks passed, David found himself looking forward to these conversations with Grace. She had opinions about everything from current events to literature, and she challenged his thinking in ways that the other women in his life never did. When he mentioned a book he was reading about social inequality, Grace had not only read it but had thoughtful insights about the author's arguments. "You know," she said one evening as she prepared dinner, "I think sometimes people assume that because someone works with their hands or in service, they don't think deeply about the world. But some of the smartest people I know are the ones who clean offices at night while studying for their degrees during the day." David realized she was right. He had grown up in such a privileged bubble that he had never really considered the intelligence and determination it took for someone like Grace to work full-time while pursuing her education. She was juggling responsibilities that would overwhelm most people, yet she did it all with grace and good humor. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his efforts to find David the perfect wife. He had narrowed his favorites down to 3 candidates and was pushing harder for David to make a choice. "The Henderson family is hosting a charity auction next month," Marcus announced over breakfast. "I think it would be an excellent opportunity for you to escort Catherine. Her family has agreed to donate a significant piece to the auction, and it would show our support for their philanthropic efforts." David nodded absently, his attention divided between his father's words and watching Grace as she quietly refilled their coffee cups. She moved with such quiet efficiency, anticipating their needs before they even realized them. When she reached to clear Marcus's plate, she stumbled slightly, and David instinctively reached out to steady her. Their hands touched for just a moment, but David felt an electric shock run through him. Grace looked up, meeting his eyes, and for a second the rest of the world seemed to fade away. Then she quickly recovered, murmuring an apology and continuing with her work. Marcus, absorbed in reading the financial pages, had missed the entire exchange, but David couldn't stop thinking about that moment of connection. He began to realize that what he felt for Grace was something entirely different from his lukewarm feelings toward the women his father approved of that evening. David found himself unable to concentrate on the business reports spread across his desk. Instead, he kept thinking about Grace's dreams of becoming a nurse, her dedication to her studies, and the way she treated everyone around her with such genuine respect. He thought about how she had cared for her sick grandmother and how she had overcome the tragedy of losing her parents at such a young age, for the first time in his life. David was beginning to understand the difference between attraction and love, between compatibility and genuine connection. The realization both excited and terrified him, because he knew that his feelings for Grace would change everything about the life his father had planned for him. As he sat in his office late that night, David could hear Grace moving quietly through the penthouse, finishing her evening duties. He found himself drawn to seek her out, to continue their conversations that had become the highlight of his days. But he also knew that acknowledging his feelings would set him on a collision course with his father's expectations and everything he had been raised to believe about his place in the world. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything David believed about love, family, loyalty, and the courage to follow his heart, even when it meant defying the most powerful man in his life.